I think Bitcoiners are going to be the 1% of political and economic power. So whether we like it or not, like, we're the first generation of Bitcoiners. So there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. Inflation is theft, right? And I think like Bitcoin is like the most moral investment like you can make. Once you see Bitcoin, like you can't, unsee it. Or interest payments alone are, the second or third largest, line item in the government budget. So it's like, there's no really getting out of that. That is like the debt spiral. And so
what's your best guess at the Bitcoin price by the end of the year? Do you think the 4-year cycle still holds?
Oh man. All right, let's get right into it.
Today, I'm excited to welcome Wyatt O'Rouke to the podcast. Wyatt is CEO at Basilic, a Bitcoin financial advisor helping people with sound money strategies, and the author of The Bitcoinization of Finance. Welcome to the Bitcoin Age, Wyatt.
Thank you so much, Paul. Honored to be here.
It's great to see you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you found Bitcoin.
Absolutely. So I always joke, I was like traditionally trained in finance, and like a lot of good that did me, got like a Keynesian, spent a ton of money on like a Keynesian finance degree. And I was like, thought it was the right thing to do, as a kid. Then when you get on the real world and you start learning actual things, you realize it's like, oh, maybe that wasn't a great decision, but you live and you learn. And I first got exposed to Bitcoin in 2017, literally like the most stereotypical way. I was like, knew a guy who was facilitating some explosive activities, and I was like, it just fit the narrative, and doesn't cash flow, all those things I was, taught in that textbook. But it wasn't really until, 2020 where I really, started embracing it. It was during COVID. I was locked in my apartment with, my roommate, who was a pretty staunch Bitcoiner. He was just berating me about, learning about Bitcoin, which I'm very fortunate he did. And so I was like, okay, I'll listen to your podcast. And then from there, it was like hook, line, and sinker. I was just, fully down the rabbit hole and haven't looked back. I always joke, like, once you see Bitcoin, like, you can't unsee it. And, given my background, I kind of initially got into it from like the finance economics perspective, and started learning about sound money and all that good stuff. I just unfortunately had no exposure to, previously. But, at that time I was working in like asset management. I just identified more as an entrepreneur, had a startup that went under. And so when it came time to, figure out my next move, I was already a Bitcoin maximalist. I'm very involved with the Denver Bitcoin community. They've been extremely influential and impactful on my career, my Bitcoin journey. I've learned just a ton from these folks that help start the space. I'm on the leadership team at the space, which is, Denver's, own Bitcoin Citadel. And it's very unique just because it is a, community run grassroots efforts. And I'm just blown away by the talent in our group. But ultimately decided to start Basilic. I wanted to start a Bitcoin company, but it's like I couldn't code. All my career, or, my experience and skills were in finance. And so I was just talking to a bunch of mentors and friends, and ultimately decided on the RIA business model. So just went fully independent from the start, because I wanted to help people, with Bitcoin. And, my peers were other maximalists. So we've been intentional from the start to build a firm rooted in I would always call like the Bitcoin ethos and doing things the right way. So like you mentioned, we help people with sound money strategies, and that's, a lot of times, helping people, with the existing stack, identify what's important to them, what's actually worth spending Bitcoin on, how to preserve their Bitcoin, inheritance planning, multi-sig, custody solutions. And so it's been very exciting and a ton of fun. And, Bitcoiners are the best people to work with. It's a very fun and interesting community. I love meeting, Bitcoiners from different walks of life and hearing what their story, how they got into it. And so I'm just having an absolute blast doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, I agree. Bitcoiners are wonderful. And you really did go down the rabbit hole and wrote a book, The Bitcoinization of Finance, which is amazing. I've been reading some of it, but what inspired you to write it, and what's your core message that you hope readers take away?
Yeah, definitely. So it's kind of funny. I think rightfully so, the finance industry kind of gets a bad name, and, a lot of my Bitcoin friends are like poking me in the ribs. It's like, I don't need a financial advisor. I have Bitcoin. It's like, there's some truth to that. Don't get me wrong, but you're at an interesting point of time where, we're really kind of seeing the blending of, the existing fiat system and this new emerging, decentralized, Bitcoin system. And so, professional, advice is still, very pertinent, to a lot of people. And, what I, really like and respect about a lot of Bitcoiners is that a lot of times they're committed to a craft and, they have something that they're passionate about and they want to focus on that. Unfortunately, Bitcoin gives them the opportunity to do that, just from a sound money perspective, but that doesn't mean, they might not necessarily be utilizing it or their existing asset base or have a full understanding of their liabilities or where they want to go in the future. And so that's where I really try to step in, be a trust advisor, confidant, help them see around corners, maybe consider things that they haven't previously. But it was really kind of this bad taste that Bitcoiners had about finance that really kind of encouraged me to write the Bitcoinization of Finance, because I think every industry is susceptible to fiatness, right? There's a great book, Fiat Food. We can, as Bitcoiners, it's more obvious to us, but we really kind of see like the degradation of our daily lives and, services or institutions, we may have previously had, trust in. And I think this is really largely due to the money, but I really kind of think of finance, simply as kind of like the business of money. So it's like most susceptible to fiatness or just fakeness. And so, while we're entering like this transitionary period, I always kind of, phrase this too. And it's like, I don't know when hyper Bitcoinization is going to happen or, when we move to like a, Bitcoin standard, but I feel pretty confident in that direction. Right. And, it's like not the perfect analogy, but I kind of think of it in the terms of, it's like that old saying, it's like, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, where it's like, I kind of think of it, it's like the more complex system, like the longer it can take to play out. And so it's like, while we're in that phase of it playing out, it's like understanding the nuances of finances and how Bitcoin can make it better, because, there's nothing inherently wrong with a derivatives contract or a loan, these are business contracts. And so it's like how we apply Bitcoin to those, different tools, products, and strategies to ultimately, make it better. And it's going to be very important at the beginning of this transition that we get some things right. And Bitcoin is the first ever, digital bear asset. I really kind of frame in like the context of my financial planning clients. It's like, whether we like it or not, like we're the first generation of Bitcoiners. So there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. And it's like what I'm trying to do. I think, anybody in Bitcoin can apply like Bitcoin principles to their industry. Me working in the finance industry, like, I'm trying to do that, myself. When I'm advocating for or working with different companies or service providers, I get really excited because, the Bitcoin financial services industry is really, growing and taking off. There's different lending products, there's different, investment and asset management products, but I get really scrupled on like who, I decide to do business with and recommend my clients to. But the fact that this industry is growing gives me, it sits in like an advisory role a lot of the time, like more optionality for my clients, which is great. But that only, happens if we, get the integration of Bitcoin into finance, right. So, I really think, the Bitcoinization of finance is really kind of centered around, a financial system where custody, settlement, and value are unified in one internet native neutral, protocol. We're able to, remove the paper layer that is so detrimental in finance, a lot of the times, and take advantage of Bitcoin's, super feature, which is the ability for us to take custody of the asset.
Yeah, and we're going to go into that in more depth. But just one other thing that really enjoyed in your book, you talk about the breakdown of the US monetary system. And you mentioned the fiat food and that breaking down. But what are some of the other things that are breaking down in society right now that you see?
Oh man! All right, let's get right into it. It's a great question, and honestly, I really kind of like multiple things about Bitcoin, obviously, but it's as a pretty type A numbers oriented person, like I really like that. Bitcoin's very black and white. Yeah, and, we have this like central source of truth, so I get a lot of comfort and excitement in that. One of my favorite things though is kind of like there's a lot of like qualitative aspects of Bitcoin, as well. And I just think when we have this current system that's essentially like rotting underneath us, it really kind of creates like a sense of despair that I think is like very prevalent in our modern day secular culture. And I'm a pretty conservative guy, and Charlie Kirk, he was just on Tucker Carlson. He's, started Turning Point USA, spends a lot of time on college campuses. And like the biggest thing that stuck out to me from that interview, having spent a lot of time, with young people, is like their anxiety about their current economic, situation. I just, met up with my parents, and they're talking about like, what we pay for rent versus like what their mortgage is and how much their house is appreciated. It's like all that things, it's like, millennials and Gen Z are really kind of, bearing the brunt of, and, that kind of manifests itself. I'm kind of interested in like the philosophical, cultural aspects of that. Spend a lot of time, opining and writing, about it. Wasn't the most pertinent, things to the book, but it's still something I'm very concerned on. So if you're just constantly falling behind, constantly being stole from, but you don't know it, it's hard to put like your finger on like what's actually, happening, while still feeling like all the emotions of it happening to you. And so I just think like, when we move to, a Bitcoin, Bitcoinized system, a lot of people, it's absolutely possible today to live on a Bitcoin standard, just whether, you're comfortable and willing to take the leap. But, if you're, storing and saving and, accounting in a system that, doesn't, erode underneath your feet, I think, what stems from there is just like, confidence. And it's like, you just have like the ability to, think about the future. There's a whole, low time preference aspect of, Bitcoin that, I like, fan of history, not like a formal historian at all. But, when we're kind of looking at like this exciting new future and this new technology, it can kind of be a lot to take in. It's like, well, where are we going? And so I actually find a lot of comfort, looking to the past, and very, devout my faith. I'm a Catholic, and, Catholics, have this, long history and old, aristocratic Europe, where, even like the wealthy, families, they had this strong moral obligation, around their wealth. And a lot of times that manifested in taking care of like their hyper, local community. Like they felt obligated to do so and do good, with their wealth. And to me, that is just so analogous, with Bitcoin. And, I think Bitcoiners are going to be the 1% of political and economic power. So how do we look to the past and, just learn those lessons from our peers and predecessors and apply them to, modern day life? And so, I see like this breakdown in our culture and society. It's extremely high time preference. We've lost this sense of community. And I get very excited, about Bitcoin, building that back, because if money is the base market and everything else is built on that, well, having a solid foundation is obviously a good place to start, right? So I'm very hopeful and optimistic about, how we can kind of like culturally reset, and move away from like a largely credit-based and high time preference society, and make, sound decisions that are rooted in some sort of data. Because, a lot of times, right now our economic decisions are largely gambling, because the economic measuring stick is constantly moving. It's like we have no sense, and it's so distorted on how to actually, apply our capital. And they actually talk about this in the Charlie Kirk and Tucker interview too, just like the proliferation of like sports gambling. And it's like the younger generations have like no interest in savings, because, they kind of implicitly know it's like their wealth is getting, eroded away, and they're just hoping for a lottery ticket. And that has a lot of, I think, negative downstream, cultural and societal impacts that we're looking to correct.
In that interview, is Bitcoin the solution?
Unfortunately, they did not mention it. And I was hoping it's like, mention Bitcoin, please mention Bitcoin. It felt like it was on the tip of their tongue, the whole time. And, I tweeted about this too, where it's like, I'm definitely seeing some, trends in the conservative, movement, where it's like, they quite haven't, identified it, but they're kind of identifying, a lot of the root causes. They talk about, debt. I think it was either millennials or Gen Z. It's like the most indebted, generation. A lot of times, it's just student loans for like these worthless degrees. And so, it's like they're certainly feeling, the pressure of a, eroding fiat credit system. But I'm hoping like they actually start identifying in the mainstream conservative movement a little bit more. That's like, well, Bitcoin actually is a solution. It's here, and that should be, a welcoming sight, because, there is an answer.
Hey there. Don't forget to like and subscribe to help me grow the channel. Want to sleep easy? Microseed lets you stamp your seed phrase onto a small steel washer. Buy the device once and use it forever. I love it. It's discreet, precise, and easy to transport. Get yours below. For powerful self-custody with no backdoors, I recommend the Trezor wallet. For peace of mind with collaborative custody, The Bitcoin Advisor is a trusted team who can also help with inheritance planning. Just scan the QR code or use the link below. And check out these super cool Satoshis with over 40 styles to choose from. Plus 10% off with my link below. Now, back to the show. Yeah, and with M2 money supply rising again, and we are close to all-time highs, you'd think more people would come in and see what we see. But where do you think we are in the cycle, and what do you think the M2 means for Bitcoin going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was very optimistic at the start of the Trump administration, where it's like, if there was, I think, an opportunity in my lifetime to actually cut spending, I'm fully on board with Lindahl and school of thought. It's like nothing stops this train. I think that's true. I think it's like mathematically guaranteed. But I thought we might at least be able to slow it with Doge, and it's obviously, we know it's like there's so much waste and like bureaucracy and yada yada, but ultimately, I was pretty disappointed when that like fell flat on its face, recently with the, passing of the big, beautiful bill. And so I was like starting to get a little, discouraged, where it's like, man, I really thought this was the opportunity, if we ever have one, to actually, put some constraints on all this, spending and money printing. And of course it didn't happen, but then, I was like sad for like a second. I was like, well, this is why we Bitcoin, I'm more bullish on Bitcoin now than ever before. And, it's very unfortunate, right? So it's like, we have all these, government obligations and liabilities, and, it's getting to the point here as well. We're seeing, the recent news, it's like all this, pressure that the Trump administration is putting on, Jerome Powell to lower rates. And, this is, I think, what to just high level kind of recap, I think what, Lynn's getting at, it's like when you constantly have to keep printing money to fund your day-to-day operations, and then you have to pay interest on that. It's like our interest payments alone are, the second or third largest, line item in the government budget. So it's like, there's no really getting out of that. That is like the debt spiral. And so when you have to keep printing, money, I did tweet that graph, like the M2 money supply, it's like, okay, it explodes in 2020. And then, it's like 22 or 23, they're like, oh, we're tightening rates, quantitative, tightening. And it's like a little blip of it ticking down, and then we're just right back up, And so when we're looking at that and trying to contextualize and what that means in our day-to-day lives, is like everything's going to get more expensive because there's more dollars in circulation. When I'm working with my clients in like financial planning aspect, I use a 6% inflation rate, because I think, somebody told me this, Mr. M, he refers to it as a CPY. I was like, oh man, that's too good. I gotta start using that, because it's a fake, manipulated, government statistic. Conservatives bend it, liberals bend it, they just use it to like craft whatever narrative they're trying to do. And it's actually not a useful, number for us to pay any attention to. So I use M2 money supply as like the, growth of, average growth of money in the system over the last 10 years, about 6%. And so I model that as inflation. And it's like, it's very hard to like kind of understand. It's like, yeah, when we go to the grocery store, it's like, we know it's like prices are up. But then especially when you forecast out, it's like over 30, 40, 50 years, like compounding year over year, it's like the number is like pretty large by the time we get to end of somebody's plan. And I do this like little exercise at the beginning when I'm presenting a plan. It's like, I just ask them, it was like, what do you think a bottle of Coke was 50 years ago, 40 years ago? And it's like 15 cents, 50 cents or whatever. It's like a triple or quadruple digit increase to today. So it's like, when we're just looking at, spreadsheet right now, it's kind of hard to conceptualize. It's like, well, how could my medical expenses actually be, this large, 40 years from now? It's like, well, if you, teleported 40 years in the past and just like ask yourself, it's like, well, how could a bottle of Coke be like this expensive in the future? It's like, you really kind of have to like break down like your walls of how you think about things, and just kind of understand it's like, it's unfortunate that we're in this situation. There's nothing you or I did to get us here. I think this is a failure of leadership over decades now, and we should be frustrated about that. But we have to work with the tools at our discretion, and Bitcoin ends up being like the tool in most instances where people can fight the current reality they're in. I should preface too, is purely educational purposes, not financial advice. But when we look to the past and then, try to identify or, build on those lessons that we can learn from and apply them to the future, whether it's like the moral obligations or teachings or literally just like looking at the numbers, then we can contextualize a plan on building on a solid foundation, which a lot of times for my clients who tend to be pretty Bitcoin heavy and what that looks like.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear your allocations. But before we get there, what's your best guess at the Bitcoin price by the end of the year? And do you think the 4-year cycle still holds?
It's a great question. To be frank, it's like I have no idea, what the price is going to be. But I think this is important too. Like, I'm interested, in macroeconomics. I'm not like a professionally trained, economist or anything like that. But I just, like that kind of stuff. But what I think is important in understanding macro is like, these are very complex systems and there's a lot of data points and a lot of variables. So it's kind of easy to connect dots and draw your own conclusion just because there's so many dots to choose from, right? So I really try to keep it, 30,000-foot view and identify themes. I'm a big believer in like the fourth turning and, Ray Dalio's, 250-year sovereign debt crisis. And when you lay those two over each other, it's like, we're really kind of like right at the end of the both of those. And so understanding that context, when I'm looking, high level at the themes, I tend to think, we are at the end of, the traditional, 4-year cycles. And I think, a lot of finance people too, specifically, kind of misguide themselves as they're a lot of times using, equity analysis and applying it to Bitcoin. It's like there are some, useful metrics and measures like you can take from one and apply to the other. But at the same time, it's like we have to understand, it's like, well, Bitcoin is actually unique and different in many ways. And so a lot of times does a disservice, for using, trying to, cram a square peg in a round hole and apply some of these TradFi techniques to Bitcoin. And so, and you just think of, Bitcoin being finitely scarce and dollars being infinite and unscarce. There's I really rely heavily on, Jesse Meyer's graphic, where he has like the, global assets. And I really enjoy, I think a couple people have, on Twitter, like plugged in like the MicroStrategy or strategy, new products like onto those and how they're siphoning, capital, out of those traditional assets and into Bitcoin. And so that's really kind of what I touch on too in the book, where it's like, okay, it's like hyper Bitcoinization doesn't happen without finance. I think that's silly to think, And so how do we, tweak or apply traditional financial tools, products, and strategies to Bitcoin? And, the largest pools of capital in the world will start leveraging, these tools and products and, siphon more of those dollars into Bitcoin. And as that just gets easier and more prolific, I really don't see how we can, stay in the traditional, 4-year cycle, even with like the halvings and, Bitcoin will continue to do what Bitcoin does. It's all the things outside of Bitcoin now that are affecting it that I think will kind of break the traditional or historic, cycle pattern. And, it's like, we'll still have the ups and downs. I tend to think just like when I put my TradFi hat on, it wouldn't surprise me if it's more of a round number than not. People, so it's like, okay, I'm setting my price target at 150 or 200,000 or whatever it is. I think that's just like some primal lizard brain, aspect that, humans still have. It's like, I don't think too many people are setting, their limit orders at, 147,000 or whatever. So it wouldn't surprise me if we get to like some sort of round number or even number in that sort of range.
Yeah, that sounds about right. It'll be interesting to see. Well, I say 139, but I said that a year ago.
Okay. I like that. Good for
Yeah,
you.
but a little bit shell shocked from the last cycle. But I know now with the ETFs and all of TradFi it's a different game. How can Bitcoin reshape the way we think about long-term financial planning and wealth management?
Definitely. It's a great question. Yeah, I really kind of, leverage on, two things I previously touched on. It's like, one, us being the first generation of Bitcoiners and being ready to step in that role and understanding what kind of responsibility, that entails. And then ultimately, like where I think we're going, which is like the 1% of political and economic power. So if we know both of those things, we know storing and keeping extreme care, taking extreme care of our Bitcoin is number one, most important. So when I'm doing, a financial plan with the client, it always initially centers around their custody solution. I partner with Unchained. They're amazing. And I'm a collaborative 2 or 3 multi-sig, advocate. I have clients that use, different custody solutions, which is, fine. I don't really view my role as like, dictating, like you have to do this or, that. I really kind of, frame it in the context of risk surface area and how do we reduce our risk surface area as much as possible, understanding with any custody solution, there's going to be a series of, trade-offs. And so ultimately, like a lot of people are comfortable with their custody solution. A lot of my clients, pretty well established, Bitcoiners, have done a lot of research, you've been in the game for a while. And so, I might try to poke holes and play devil's advocate in certain situations, but as long as they feel comfortable with it, that's what's most important. Fortunately, we're able to, offer a kind of a tiered, service depending on how comfortable people are with the asset and technology. And so, and with my partner on chain, they obviously always have one key. So it's like, do you want to hold 2? For key agent services, so I can hold 1 key in a quorum. I can also offer multi-institutional custody. So it's really just identifying how comfortable somebody is with the asset and technology. But it's all centered around taking custody of the bare asset itself. It's like we're not in Bitcoin for just price appreciation. We're in Bitcoin to be uncensorable, to be self-sovereign, to build a future we want to live in. And so once we feel comfortable with that, I've adopted, a financial planning philosophy called human first, financial planning. And we spend a lot of time, working with clients and identifying their goals and, what's truly important to them. Because if I had a gripe in the Bitcoin community, and I hate seeing this, but it's, if Bitcoiners had a miss, it is making, Bitcoin an idol, which I'm just like morally and philosophically like opposed to, because it's not. It's a tool, and we need to identify as a tool. Ideally, I think will help us do, a lot of things in the future, but ultimately it's around achieving those goals. So, if somebody does want to buy that forever home to have in their family for generations, it's like, that's really important to them. Well, then that's a good thing to like spend your Bitcoin on. And that's okay. But more importantly, it's like we've identified that is very important to us. And then where I really kind of step in and, try to add a lot of value is how we're, allocating, our Bitcoin. So now there's been, like we touch on, a lot of new, products coming out, which is very exciting. So it's like, well, can we actually use like some of our Bitcoin as collateral to get dollars in a loan to purchase an asset? Are we, taking advantage of, meanwhile, it's got a very good like whole life policy, that kind of comes into like what we're leaving to, our heirs. That's like fully denominated in Bitcoin. And so ultimately, and, forecasting is more of a art than a science. Don't get me wrong, but, it's a worthwhile exercise because at the end of the plan, with my, Bitcoin clients, it tends to be a larger, dollar denominated amount than they may have originally thought was possible. And so it's like, while we're still stacking sats, or if they are moving into retirement, maybe spending some of those, so like, have we identified important causes that are close to our heart and that we want to leave this in Bitcoin to help further drive their mission and leave the world a better place than what we left it. It's like HRF, I think, is maybe like the best example of this. Is so it's like, are you planning to gift an organization like that Bitcoin to fulfill good in the world? And so that's really exciting. I think that's crucially important. I believe we've been gifted our talents and resources, and so really focus on like a lot of we do obviously get pretty in the weeds with the quantitative side of things, but also not neglecting the qualitative side of things and how we're a good steward of our Bitcoin.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that you are an advocate of self-custody in multi-sig in most cases. And do you also personally invest in strategy and their preferred offerings? And what is your allocation percentage-wise of assets? Just before we get to, because everybody would be different, right? A client might want to own Tesla and other assets, but what do you personally allocate to?
Yeah, it's funny because I am a licensed and registered fiduciary, and I have to answer to the Colorado State administrators and disclose if my personal investments are different than, what I'm recommending. And like you absolutely nailed it. It's like everybody is, different, has a unique financial situation, but it's just more funny with my, TradFi clients where it's like, yeah, just buy Bitcoin. It's like, that's what I'm interested in. I certainly think, strategy, I think, Saylor will go down as, a captain of industry type, figure with the likes of, Rockefeller, Carnegie, or, name the icon for what he's done, for corporate finance. I have a ton of, respect for that. And working in finance, I think that's extremely exciting because now we can like diversify, within Bitcoin. Another product I really like is Build Asset Management. They're a great team. They have a, private credit fund where they, buy Bitcoin collateralized loans, and, it's like you invest with fiat and you get like a fiat, return. But that's really kind of targeted at like, a fixed income investor and somebody in retirement that just kind of wants a guaranteed, income stream. Usually, in somebody like my role, they'd be, allocating, that person's, capital to bonds or, treasuries or stuff to get that interest payment. It's like, as a Bitcoiner, if I know those products aren't any good, and if you're just getting paid back with printed money, I'm really kind of in opposition to my fiduciary duty to take care of you. But this is really kind of like the point I'm trying to hammer home. It's like with, entrepreneurs, in the Bitcoin space, taking on these exciting new endeavors, it's like, okay, well, now that gives me an opportunity to give a client a, fixed income stream, but the underlying collateral is Bitcoin. It's like, that's not going to be, eroded away over time. Is like, yes, it is a, fiat return. So we got to, factor that in. But more of the story is like the underlying asset is Bitcoin. And, I really kind of put, a lot of strategies, new products in that same type of bucket where it's like, we want exposure to like the most sound money, like known to man, understanding everybody has unique needs. Well, how do we get that exposure in different ways? And fortunately, we now have the opportunity to do that, which is extremely exciting.
And what's the importance of the in-kind Bitcoin ETF redemptions? That's for institutions, right? Not for individuals.
Yeah, that's correct. Individuals, a lot of time, and this is Bitcoin's a little bit of a different story. Like ETFs that can be redeemed in kind aren't like a new thing. Those exist with different commodity-based ETFs, but you're exactly right. A lot of times, the in-kind redemption is limited to institutional players because if you take, redemption of oil, you literally have to have the capability to take delivery of that physical commodity. So it's a little different. With Bitcoins, obviously, like individuals could, in theory, take custody of the Bitcoin because it's a digital bearer asset, but the existing financial infrastructure doesn't necessarily exist. And you're right, it would be only like institutional player, unfortunately. Hopefully, we get some rewriting a laws or guidance to make that eventually possible for individuals to take redemption of in-kind Bitcoin from an ETF. But regardless, it's important forcing function for the market because that ETF provider has to have the Bitcoin in custody that they say they do. And that just removes any risk of paper Bitcoin or rehypothecation. And that's ultimately a very important, thing for the market. It's like, I'm not necessarily a fan of short selling, but I understand like it's important, dynamic to a healthy, capital markets is just like the risk of being able or the opportunity to take the other side of a bet. And that's a lot of what just finance is in general. And so in-kind redemptions really, I think, just keep traditional, players or capital markets in general, honest. And so it's a very important new approval.
Can Bitcoin's ethos of self-regulation survive as institutions and governments enter the space?
I certainly hope so. I think it's more or less impossible for, the government to like co-opt Bitcoin or anything. I think like the game theory would play out similar to like wealth taxes we've seen around the world. It's like, they try to put this wealth, tax in. I think, France is a famous example of this, and like all the money flees, the country, and, they reverse it and stuff like that. I think, if a government tried to be like very like iron fisted around Bitcoin, like, something similar would happen in that country ultimately, or jurisdiction would end up, losing. Hopefully they would reverse it. But this is just the nature of dealing with a, truly neutral, decentralized, free market. It's like, it's a little amorphous, and it's like, well, it doesn't, TikTok next block, like Bitcoin doesn't care. The people who take advantage of it will move to the places where they're most free to take advantage of it. I believe that to be true. That being said, I think we have a very important responsibility as Bitcoiners, and this is just like the most simple pleb is just stack sats to stay humble. Like that's amazing. I think people building businesses in Bitcoin bear more of this responsibility, and this is something I try to hammer home in the book as well. It's like I try extremely hard to do business with Bitcoin only companies. And I have like an internal checklist where if I'm thinking of, taking on or, adopting like a new partner to like recommend my clients to, it's like, well, do you pass like my Bitcoin smell test? It's like, I think, River's a fantastic example of this. It's like proof of reserves, multi-sig, cold storage, Bitcoin only. So if we, people like myself building Bitcoin or building a business within Bitcoin, decide to do or only do business with other folks, building to the Bitcoin ethos, eventually, that's a free market system of like self-regulation where it's like, well, actually, no, I'm not going to do business with this exchange because they support, altcoins and gambling, and I'm opposed to those things. So I'm not going to recommend my clients give them their money. I'm not going to give them any money. I'm going to support the people doing business the right way. And so I think, if the industry as a whole kind of adopts this philosophy, it's like we're going to stave off any potential negative regulations because we've shown the capability to take responsibility for our own actions and do business, with people who share that mindset. And so I am, just kind of generally small government, free market, little libertarian, principles kind of guy, understanding, if I'm just playing devil's advocate, I understand, if I was like some central banker, like the threat Bitcoin may pose. And so it's like we shouldn't be I think ignorant to what the other side may be thinking. And so it's just try to get a step ahead. And it's like FTX is a great example. It's like it was kind of a stain on the industry because they did things the fiat way, the exact wrong way of what you should do. So if we just take that upon ourselves to just do things the right way from the beginning, we'll be able to avoid a lot of those negative externalities.
Yeah, those are good points. So do you think we will see at some point in our lives a hyper Bitcoinized world where we use mostly Bitcoin, or Bitcoin does become the world reserve currency?
I do. I do. And I hope I do see that. But, if it's, my children that end up seeing that, I think, we would still have, done our job to get there. And so, and that's, again, kind of so from, identifying these macro trends like the inability to cut spending, the proliferation of M2 money supply, the social degradation of the upcoming generations and, their indebtedness and inability to understand like what's going on to them, like the high temperance, high time preference thinking. I think those things are very hard to reverse. Like there's a lot of momentum about it, and I think Bitcoin is the biggest benefactor, of those kind of threads unraveling. That being said, this is where I think it's important for us to not get like too high and mighty and think we all have crystal balls. Even though I'm seeing these trends, I have a lot of conviction in them. I think the Genius Act is kind of a good example. It's like, well, the dollar, this might be a point in time, and we look back 10, 20 years ago, or into the past from now. It's like, okay, well, that's just like one move they were able to do to extend the life of the dollar. So that's why I kind of mean when I was talking earlier about these complex systems taking a long time to die out. Like there's multiple different levers they could probably pull to extend the life, but ultimately I think it's inevitable. We live in a hyper Bitcoinized world.
Yeah, it's so hard to imagine because so far up till now, the powerful people have always found a way. And, Jeff Booth says that the fiat and Bitcoin cannot exist in the same world because they are two completely different systems, one based on deflation and the other based on inflation. So, yeah, I know smarter people see things I don't. Either way, we're going to hold Bitcoin.
That's right. That's right.
whether it works or not. Yeah. Yeah. So, why is the expansion of the Bitcoin capital markets so essential?
Great question. So ultimately, yeah, I'll kind of reference this back to, Jesse's graph. So if we think of, money as the, base market and kind of like, so, the US dollar right now is kind of like the standard, unit of account. But, if we just think of, money, I think, Lynn does a great job of this, explaining it as like this economic, you know, measuring stick. I don't think like, maybe some Bitcoiners want this, but I don't want to get back into like a barter based system. I think specialization is a good thing. I think economics and money and capital markets are a good thing. I'm a staunch capitalist, and I think capitalism is directly correlated to human prosperity, and so it's like we shouldn't reject capitalism at its face just because it's been co-opted. I think we actually live in like a crony capitalist society. I think Bitcoin really kind of uh, enables capitalism to like its fullest form, right? Because if you have like an 800-pound gorilla in the room, I kind of think this is like the Federal Reserve that can just push a button, more money. It's like the obviously with the banks and base, there's broad money, some nuances there, but ultimately, in a credit-based systems, like you are able to constantly keep adding, dollars to the equation and distorting that economic measuring stick. It's like, yeah, it might be, look like capitalism or was more true capitalism at one point in time, but that's just not the case anymore. And so, if Bitcoin kind of neutralizes that, 800-pound gorilla in the world, and we have a consistent economic measuring stick that is, global and neutral, that ultimately I think is like the most true form of capitalism, because you have a truly free market, and the base market, money is like the most true and free. So everything that's built on top of that, you'd be kind of able to like deduce back in like a more logical sense of like, if I'm, building a house, like what that actually, cost me from just like, the raw inputs, because I know like the base unit and the base market is more true. And so I think, we could, potentially see even more human flourishing than what we have in the past, just because that base market isn't distorted and you can actually make informed and better, economic decisions. And that's why it's like, I don't think we need to throw, the baby out with the bathwater, that really being finance. Obviously, it's a useful practice. It's an industry been around for hundreds of years. And so if we can take like the best of traditional finance and apply it to Bitcoin, we'll be able to accelerate it and still use like a lot of the tools available to us. Like there's nothing inherently wrong with a derivatives contract. It's a business contract where two parties decide to take either side of the trade. It's like, okay, great. Like, why won't we want that existing in a Bitcoin world as well?
Yeah. And on that note, how does Bitcoin lending work, and what are some of the biggest opportunities and risks that you see?
Great question. I'm actually seeing, a lot of, inbound interest on the lending front. I'm not necessarily opposed to, debt as a lot of people are, and, understand or sympathetic to some of the moral arguments around that. But specifically within Bitcoin lending, it's kind of funny. Like, one of my favorite sayings in Bitcoin, I don't know who said this, but it was like, Bitcoin is how your grandma thinks money works. There's a lot of truth in that. And I actually think, you can kind of like copy and paste that to lending, specifically. I'm pretty bullish, on the lending space. I think that, subsector of the Bitcoin financial services market is actually going to experience like the largest or fastest amount of growth, over the next couple of years or so. It's really, again, I was kind of talking previously about looking to the past and applying it to the future. It's like with Bitcoin loans, it's really that, in a credit based system, a lot of times like you can get a credit card, which is like a form of lending with no collateral, maybe a credit check, but there's no like physical collateral involved. So it used to be in a more sound capitalist in economic environment, is there was like actual capital or collateral backed up in a loan. And so not every, Bitcoin lending, company or operation is built equally. We do a lot of due diligence on different firms, but I would just say, the best cases scenarios, it's like you generally have like a 50% LTV, which is, also kind of referred to as, collateral to principals. Bitcoin's at like 117 right now or whatever. Let's just say $100,000 for simplicity's sake. Like if you wanted $100,000, you would have to put up $200,000 worth of Bitcoin. And, you got to like dig into the fine print and see like repayment terms. Some companies, offer like what they call like bullet loans and like the old TradFi sense where you just pay back interest plus collateral or your principal, at the end of the loan. Some give you option to pay on it, like a normal, monthly rate over the course of the loan. But what I like about Bitcoin collateralized lending is it's actually a very simple concept for the companies that do it the Bitcoin way. And so you as a borrower want dollars, so the lender has dollars. In return, you move your Bitcoin to like an escrow wallet. And again, best case scenario, this is 2 of 3 multi-sig. So the lender has a key, the borrower has a key, and then a third party key agent has a key. So your Bitcoin goes in the collateral, you have $200,000 worth of Bitcoin, you get the $100,000 in cash. And then again, ultimately, we're just dealing with a business contract. It's like, well, did you pay back the principal and interest? Did you fulfill your terms of the agreement? Yes or no? Yes, you get your Bitcoin back. They get their dollars back. No, your Bitcoin may be liquidated. The lender is made whole. The kind of like funny thing about that is like over collateralization in loans used to be like a common thing. And I think like as fiat got more pervasive and credit got more pervasive, like real estate, this is pretty common where you're only actually getting like a percentage of like the asset value. So you're not even getting the whole asset value as collateral, let alone 200% of the asset values. Bitcoiners are incentivized to make sure that that loan's paid off because they don't want to lose their Bitcoin, which is in the form of collateral right now. Lenders also feel more comfortable in this market as well because they know it's like regardless if Bitcoin is still volatile and this asset class in price discovery mode, it's finding its way. It will do its thing. So they're protected in case of a bear market or massive drawdown that their loan it could be made whole. But again, if you work with quality institutions, you'll be notified. If the loan gets to 70% LTV, it's like you need to top off your collateral. It should be clearly stated like when your liquidation LTV is, and working with a trusted party to make sure it's like that communication is extremely transparent. So the Bitcoin isn't lost in some sort of drawdown scenario. But to your previous question, why I think lending is particularly interesting in the terms of Bitcoin capital markets is as the lending industry gets larger and more prolific, the interest rate actually kind of ends up being a market signal to how people perceive risk in Bitcoin. So right now it tends to be higher. I think probably averages between 12 and 15%. Part of that is just because lack of competition. This is still relatively new, so there's not like hundreds of thousands of companies that offer this. It's probably more like tens of companies that offer this service. So part of that will be driven down from just competition in the market, and then I think part of it will be driven down too because there are companies like Unchained and Firefish that have like publish these numbers a lot of times like an extremely low liquidation amount. And so what that interest rate ends up signaling to the market is like the perceived risk of Bitcoin in the future. And so when you have tens of thousands of service providers and that interest rate trends lower, that to me is like a signal in the capital markets that well, this asset that we initially thought of as risky and volatile is actually trending towards less risk, and it's less volatile because the costs we're charging to loan on it has fallen. I also think it's interesting to the cycle point too, as more Bitcoin gets locked up in collateral. I think that actually pushes the floor up to a on the drawdown perspective because a lot of that Bitcoin won't be trading on a regular basis because it is locked up in escrow. So I think a lot of the lending markets in your traditional capital markets are kind of, like plumbing, right? And so it's like, if you have a healthy, lending market, there's a lot of different, information and data points like you can pull from that. I think that's equivalent and pertinent in Bitcoin as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So in that scenario, rehypothecation wouldn't be a risk because it wouldn't be possible.
In that scenario I just outlined,
Yeah.
rehypothecation is impossible. That being said, it's like some service providers, centralize with or custody with a centralized custodian, and it's a little harder to, fully know where your Bitcoin is. It's like we should do business with, people that do things the right way. I would consider that scenario I just outlined the right way. That doesn't mean everybody does it. I think there's even been, service providers that will give you a lower interest rate if you let them, rehypothecate your Bitcoin. I would never advocate for that. I would steer, clear away from any rehypothecation. And that's why it's like, I, encourage, companies that are interested in building, a lending business, like just do a 2 or 3 multi-sigs. Like, what are you scared of? Like, this is what I believe to be the proper way of doing, a loan business.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just want you to comment on the volatility as a feature, not a bug, because we all know that we hear that in the Bitcoin world, but taking a loan out when Bitcoin's around 200 and we still don't know the cycle, that might be a little bit risky. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, when I hear like the volatility is a feature, not a bug, I generally like agree with that sentiment. I always cite this report from OnRamp, where they did a study on, it's like, well, there's actually more good volatility in Bitcoin than bad volatility. And when I take that, a step further about, really trying to understand like what it means to be a feature, then, I think one of the coolest things about, Bitcoin is that, it's a truly grassroots movement. Like, there's no marketing department, no pre-mine, nobody, CEO trying to, shield their token, dump it on retail. So like, Bitcoin's not like that. In the ethos of like a grassroots movement, that gives, opportunity for folks like you and I to like get in and see the price appreciation, experience what it's like to hold a savings technology, because there's a higher odds that, that Bitcoin that, I bought today would appreciate more in the future than it would like depreciate. I think that's what really, and, the numbers today back that up. That's obviously like historical data, but that's what I think, people really mean, and what I believe it to mean, that, that volatility is a feature where it allows the individual to get in early and experience the good volatility and the price appreciation, the Bitcoin, nascent asset class, finding its way, and, experiencing, traditional capital flows, moving into Bitcoin and pushing, the dollar price up, which is, very exciting. I think that kind of culturally, resets ourselves too, because, it wasn't, and nearly, I mean, goodness, like, has to be every other system. It's usually the top, or people like most in the know that are stand to benefit the most, where it's like, well, you Bitcoin's for everybody. And I think it really kind of gives the opportunity for like, the plebs or people at the bottom to actually get in early and have more, not only purchasing power, but I think ultimately in the future, political power, as well, because of that good volatility.
Yeah, I really like that. Bitcoin is
Well,
for
thank you.
everybody. What would you say to people, still getting in? What would your recommendation be? Do you have any targets? It depends what part of the world you're in, but
Definitely. Yeah, it's a very important, question, and, understanding like not financial bias, and everybody's, specific instance is unique, but most importantly, it's like get off zero. So I generally, find there are, different, acquisition strategies you could do with, volume weighted or whatever, but, dollar cost averaging tends to be just like the, tried and true bread and butter. It's what I personally do. That's what I advocate for the most. It's like, just start building a small position if you, don't have any Bitcoin. I'm gonna talk out of both sides of my mouth here for a second. I just like, usually I'm just like, buy and forget it. That's usually, it's like when you're like a little larger, stack, it's not very useful to just like constantly be obsessed and watching the price. I don't think that's a healthy thing to do, regardless of what you own. But if you're just getting started, I do think there is like a valuable lesson, in the beginning, to just like monitor the price. It's like, when it's up, you feel great. When it's down, you're like, oh, this is a bummer. So it's just kind of getting used to that, and building your position like slowly over time allows you to build conviction in your position as well. And then after what I see pretty frequently is like, okay, somebody did that, they built a conviction, they understand. It's like their mindset almost switched. Is like when it goes lower, they're almost more excited because like, great, I get to stack more Bitcoin. Or, if they, then come into some money from whatever, it's like, okay, well, now I feel comfortable, making a larger asset allocation decision, whether that's, lump sum or increasing, or DCA buy, because, you build that conviction like slowly over time. I think that, that's crucially important just for anything, really kind of embraces like the low time preference ethos of Bitcoin, because it can be a little nerve wracking. Yeah, first I think you kind of got to build some calluses, and that's a useful exercise. If you tend to own and hold Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's very useful. So, where do you see the strongest alignment between your Christian values and Bitcoin principles?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you so much. This is something I think about a lot. I'm surprised, like the more people I talk to in this front and the more research I do, how overlapped the two really are. And we have theft is like a sin, and 10 commandments. And I think this is like a lot Christians specifically aren't necessarily keen on the fact that inflation is theft, right? And I think like Bitcoin is like the most moral investment like you can make. There's nobody behind the scenes pulling the strings. Nobody stands to be worse off because you made a investment into Bitcoin. And so it's very unique in that aspect. I think this really has, a lot to do with, it's extremely hard to find a neutral, truly decentralized system. I think, very few of those exist. I think you might be able to make the case for an argument for like the internet, but I think, that's then been co-opted since, its inception. And so understanding Bitcoin is, moral money, because, you aren't robbing, you aren't getting robbed from inflation. You aren't robbing your neighbor of inflation. Nobody stands to be worse off because you made investment into Bitcoin. And then I think of like the greater kind of like ethos and philosophy. It really gives the ability to you kind of remove a level of abstraction that I think is like tyranny, a lot of times. So you kind of remove like the tyranny or any sort of centralized planner that is trying to tell you how to live your life. Yeah, I think it's crucially important that each individual has personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And Bitcoin itself facilitates, peer-to-peer, transactions. Like, the Bible literally tells us that, businesses and conflict should, be resolved on like the lowest possible level. And that'd be like you and I having a dispute and like working through it ourselves. And so it's like Bitcoin itself like facilitates, a lot of these, Christian principles. And the church has been, persecuted, before. I think, it would be ignorant for us to think it won't be persecuted, in the future. So it's like, are we embracing a resource that allows us to fulfill our mission here on Earth? It's like, I believe, it's like I'm a pilgrim on Earth. And so it's like, am I doing like the most good like I possibly can? And a lot of times like embracing Bitcoin or, donating Bitcoin to, those causes that we care a lot about, getting the church to accept Bitcoin, like it really helps us accomplish those missions, because like we have a, sound money that just gives us, more economic power. And one thing I do try to phrase, the Christian context as well. It's not about, getting rich. It's about, being in control of our future and fulfilling the mission of the church, we've been trying to fulfill for the last 2,000 years. And I think Bitcoin is the best tool to allow us to do that.
Yeah, that's for sure.
If you will allow me here, quick, there's this one, Luke 12:48 that I really like here. It's from everyone who's been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. And so I really just think that applies like so cleanly, to Bitcoiners and kind of everything I was referencing about, 1% political and economic power, being the first generation. It's like we need to, really kind of embrace that and be good stewards of the asset, because we're going to have the ability to craft the future we want to live in. And without a strong moral worldview, just because you have more economic resources, like you're not going to get to the end goal.
Yeah, those are really good points. And I would just like to say that many of those values are across other religions too. And Bitcoin is for everybody. But either way, Bitcoin really just makes a better world because it really forces us to be honest. It's an honest
100%.
network. So it's going to be better. I respect everybody's beliefs, but it's going to be a better world no matter what you believe.
100% right. Yeah. It's like, a lot of major religions. Yeah. It's like you make the same case in arguments for Bitcoin for sure.
And on that note, I know you mentioned Bitcoin is not an idol, and I absolutely agree. But do you think it could be used as a spiritual tool?
No, I don't. That's my personal beliefs. It's like making money an idol is like hazard number one. I think there's a lot of evils that come from that. Very spiritual person, so I find a lot of comfortability in just clearly identifying things. It's like, oh, is this good or is this evil? And that allows me to make decisions in my day to day life, how to move forward. Obviously, try to embrace the good as much as I possibly can, but understanding it's like one of the greatest tools of evil is deception. And so I think when we take our eye off God, like we're being deceived, and again, it's just identifying and believing Bitcoin's a tool. It's not a higher power. I think thinking Bitcoin is spiritual would be deception and a lower power at work. I do think there's like that. I'll hone in on like the ethos again. I think there's a certain type of person that's attracted to Bitcoin. I think this is really interesting. I saw it surfacing on Twitter where it's like the Myers-Briggs test and like the ENTJs or whatever INTJs. Like a certain personality type is really attracted to Bitcoin. I think that can make Bitcoiners as a whole stronger if we have a lot of shared beliefs. But I don't believe Bitcoin itself is spiritual.
Right. Not itself is spiritual, but the way I actually mean it is as a spiritual tool, in that when we adopt Bitcoin, we have more time to look within.
Yes, I do
That's
believe
all.
that.
That's all I mean. Yeah, not as something in itself. And because what happened with me is once I adopted Bitcoin, started learning, then I started thinking, well, what's most important and what gives me meaning? So just in that way. Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. Yeah. So for our last question, how has Bitcoin changed you most?
Oh man, in a lot of ways, I think I'll kind of bring back up the space. My wife and I spend a lot of time and investment into community. I think who you surround yourself with is extremely important. I'm just like constantly blown away by the caliber of person I meet in Bitcoin, and the community building it's a lot of hard work. It takes time to get to know people and have a personal relationship with them. And I think it's like probably one of the if not the most fruitful investment you can make. So just getting really involved with the Bitcoin community, particularly at the space, I think it's one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in my life.
Oh, that's really cool. Well, thank you, Wyatt. I will post links below. Just tell us for those listening where we can find you.
Absolutely, Paul. Thank you so much. It's been a ton of fun. You can follow me on Twitter at Wyatt O'Rouke _. You can find my business at Basilic.io or some of my personal writings at WyattO'Rouke.com.
Well, thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thank you.